Welcome, everyone. My name is Amy Schultz, and I have the privilege of kicking off the webinar today. This is the fifth session in our embedded series on confronting environmental racism and promoting environmental justice as part of the broader Integrated Health Sciences Core series, webinar series. This is co-sponsored with co-developed by the Community Engagement Core and the Integrated Health Sciences Core, and it's also co-sponsored by the Environmental Health Sciences and the HBHE Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committees within the School of Public Health. I want to start with a land acknowledgement and recognize that our ability to host this webinar today and to have the conversation that we're having today is made possible by a gift, a land that was ceded by the Anishinaabe, which are the Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, along with their neighbors, the Seneca, the Delaware, the Shawnee, and the Wyandot Nation, who occupied this land and cared for it for many generations prior to ceding it to the state of Michigan for the purpose of creating the University of Michigan. That land, that gift, was given in the hope, the explicit hope by the communities who ceded the land that their children would be able to be educated at the university that was created through this process. That is a hope that has not been entirely realized, and it helps us remember the work that we need to continue to do to tear down the institutional barriers that are that exist for communities who have been historically marginalized and prevented from access to higher education. This feature or this webinar really is a conversation about environmental racism. And just to remind us that environmental racism is the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color. These two maps illustrate this idea. They are both maps of the Tri-County area. You can see the Detroit City located in the middle of those maps and then surrounded by Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb County. And the map on the left shows areas with varying degrees of exposure to particulate matter and related health hazards, with the lighter colored areas, the yellow areas, being those with the lowest concentrations of air pollutants, and increasingly red areas than areas with higher levels of exposure to air pollution. The map on the right shows the distribution of the population by race and ethnicity, with the lighter areas being predominantly white communities, and then increasingly orange and moving to red areas are areas with increasing concentrations of communities who identify as non-Hispanic, Black, or Latino. And we just share this to demonstrate the correlation, visually demonstrate the correlation between levels of exposure to air pollution and the racial and ethnic characteristics of communities in the Detroit metro area. And this now juxtaposes those same two maps on the right side with a map showing redlining in the Detroit area. And again, just to demonstrate that there is a history to the processes, there are a historical set of processes that have brought us to where we are today in terms of segregation of communities and the differential exposures of segregated communities to air pollutants and other types of environmental toxins. So, and then environmental justice really is the movement that has arisen to, in response to patterns of environmental racism. And this is a definition of environmental justice that comes from the Environmental Protection Agency and defines it as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, in the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. I bring this definition forward because there's two components I want to highlight. One is that the goal, the outcome that the movement is striving for is equitable exposure, so equity in the distribution of environmental exposures. But there is also the second component of this has a heavy emphasis on meaningful involvement, so the engagement of communities that currently are disproportionately exposed to environmental toxins in creating the solutions to those, including the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws. And that's going to be something that our two speakers today are going to talk a bit about, that there are these dual goals, both the outcome of equity and equitable engagement in the processes. I'm going to take just a quick moment before introducing our speakers to highlight a new article that just came out yesterday in the Washington Post. This is the 30th anniversary of the historic meeting that happened in Washington, D.C. In 1991, I think it was, if I have my date right, the first National People of Color Environmental Justice Institute, and it was really a very visible kicking off of the movement. There was a lot of activity that was happening prior to that, and the action that's in North Carolina that's featured in this article talks a bit about that, but there was a very visible movement initiation that happened with that meeting. And I just want to highlight, we're so fortunate today because both of our speakers, Donele Wilkins and Kathryn Savoie, were present at that historic meeting and have been actively working in the environmental justice movement since that time. So we are very fortunate to have them with us today. So their topic is environmental racism and environmental justice. I'm going to turn it over to Donele in just a moment, but quickly to say Donele is the CEO and creator of the Green Door Initiative, which is an organization that is based in Detroit, very active in around issues of climate justice, as well as the green economy. So we're really fortunate to have her today with us. And then Kathryn Savoie, who is with the Ecology Center and has been a leader in movements around environmental justice, again, for quite some time. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, turn it to Donele, and you guys are in for a treat. Okay.
Thank you so much, Amy, for kicking us off and setting the context for the conversation today. I'm really pleased to be a part of this conversation today, 30 years later. I can't believe it's been 30 years. I mean, really, it's like flipping pages in a book. So my part of this conversation will focus on the definitions as defined by the leadership, the original leadership of the environmental justice movement, which slightly differs from the Environmental Protection Agency and or the government's definition, which I think is worth mentioning. Also, I'll talk a little bit about what environmental justice and environmental activism around justice looks like in the city of Detroit and provide a context for that. I will, though, begin with a little bit of information about the Green Door Initiative, which is located in the city of Detroit. Our mission is to ensure that everyone is environmentally literate, capable of practicing and promoting a sustainable lifestyle. That is regardless of race, income, and zip code. We happen to believe that everyone has the right as human beings to breathe clean air, to drink safe water, healthy water, to be on land that's free from contaminants and pollution as much as possible. And we're really about not just equity, but about justice for the legacy of the inequities that have occurred over decades that has placed people in these dire positions, exposures. So I want to start first with the definition of environmental racism as defined by Reverend Benjamin Chavis, who was at the time the executive director of the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice at the time. Environmental racism is racial discrimination in environmental policy making. It is racial discrimination in the enforcement of regulations and law. It is racial discrimination in the deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste disposal and the siting of polluting industries. It is racial discrimination in the official sanctioning of the life-threatening presence of poisons and pollutants in communities of color. It is racial discrimination in the history of excluding people of color from the mainstream environmental groups, decision-making boards, commissions, and regulatory bodies. So that's the context in which we start the work around achieving and working towards environmental justice, which is the definition as defined by the same leadership. Environmental justice is the fair treatment of people of all races, cultures, and income with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, programs, and policies. Fair treatment means that no racial, ethnic, or social economic group should bear a disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences resulting from the operation of industrial, municipal, commercial enterprises and from the execution of federal, state, local, and tribal programs and policies. And I often say what environmental justice really is, we seek to enjoy environmental protection like everyone else in this country. And there's unequal protection under the law when it comes to environmental protection. I will also offer that Black Lives Matter, racial profiling, all of that is something we've been echoing for more than 30 years in terms of the definitions that I just shared with you. And I just want to kind of place some context about Detroit, and we'll share a little, I'll share some comparisons in the local community, but Detroit has often been cited as one of the most polluted cities in the United States. 48217, I see that Teresa Landrum is on as a participant, certainly has stood out in Detroit as the most polluted zip code in the state of Michigan, perhaps in the country. I could be, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that piece. Detroit, because we place the world on wheels, in terms of the motor city, the automobile industry, and the concentration of all things automobile occurred in the city of Detroit. There's an estimated number of contaminated or polluted sites as a result of that. They kind of stopped at 65,000 in terms of estimating the land impact of those previous industrial activities. At the time of this, at the time of this map, there were 250 of those properties that have been cleaned up and addressed, but there's many more to go. I believe we're now around 300, but certainly not where we need to be with regard to cleaning up the city of Detroit. So you can just imagine that most people who happen to be African-American in terms of population in the city of Detroit live by, on top of, next to, or in some way has been exposed to some kind of environmental problem as a result of the legacy that Detroit carries around this. I often, as Amy, Dr. Schultz knows, and Kathryn knows, I often like to ground my conversation by acknowledging a person by the name of Xavier Joe, who, by the way, I've never had the opportunity to meet in person, but his legacy is felt by me. This young person, this child, died in his mother's arms. He slipped away because he could not breathe. And also his mom did not have access to her own personal automobile or transportation. And unfortunately, in the neighborhood where she lived, she could not get anyone to help her get her child to the hospital. I mean, she did call 911. That was the headline and the story in the news at the time, but it didn't come in time. The services did not show up in time for Xavier to survive. And what I understand after meeting some childhood friends of his, that the last words he told his mom as he looked into her eyes was, "Mom is going to be okay." And I can only envision that what he really meant is that things are going to change for people. Things are going to improve for our community. And so I just don't want to ever forget Xavier Joe. Let me talk a little bit about the birth of the National Environmental Justice Movement. As Dr. Schultz mentioned, there was a pretty important event that took place in October of 1991. It was the first People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. We didn't call it environmental justice at the time until after the convening, but it is where the people who were sick and tired of being sick and tired of this country came together and began to define the environment for what in the way that we experience. And as far as we were concerned, defining the environment was where we live, where we work, where we play. Let me also add where we pray, where we learn is the physical and natural world. And I do appreciate grounding this conversation with the First Nations and the seeded gift because it is very clear that this movement has impacted all kinds of everyone, the nations, the communities, the people of color across this country. And they provide great leadership in helping to improve environmental expectations in communities across this country. And I might also add internationally. So there's a principle, well, one, you should understand if you don't know that during that convening, that important 4-day convening of which, as Dr. Schultz mentioned, I was able to participate in along with Kathryn of Savoie. There was a handful of Detroit folks there in this amazing meeting. We created the 17 principles of environmental justice. But I just want to highlight that environmental justice really embraces the principle that all people and communities are entitled to equal protection, as I mentioned earlier, of our environmental, health, employment, education, housing, transportation, and civil rights laws. And it's really key to put it here because the defining of the environmental movement went beyond pretty much sort of protecting the natural resources, which is key, which is important, but it brought in a more comprehensive approach to the quality of life that all people are entitled to. And well, I'll just kind of leave it there. So also, I appreciate the picture that Dr. Schultz shared, but this is also another picture of the civil unrest and the civil activity that folks in this community in Warren County, North Carolina did to bring attention to the fact that this little small rural community, almost 100% African American, was just sick and tired of being the designated place for the landfills, PCB landfills, and they just decided they were going to lay down in front of these trucks one day and say enough's enough. We're not going to be your dumping ground anymore. And that act of civil disobedience really is what placed the environmental justice movement on the map in terms of just getting this thing going, because the person who was leading this effort, she basically decided as a member of the United Church of Christ, she was going to approach the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice and get their help to address the problems that they were tired of dealing with. And as a result, the 1991 event took place. This is just another sort of example. Amy showed a great map of air pollution issues, and this is just a map of the toxic releases. And when you compare it to West Bloomfield Hills, you can see a real dramatic difference in terms of what those toxic releases look like. Another sort of impact is lead poisoning, and for a long time, Detroit has ranked in terms of the highest in terms of lead poisoning and elevated blood levels among children 0 to 5 years old. Something like 87% of the children diagnosed or identified as lead poisoning actually exist in the city of Detroit, outside of the state of Michigan. So that's just an example of some of the impacts and the health impacts in our community. I can go on, but I know we only have 15 minutes. I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Kathryn. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Donele. I'm just going to share my screen here, get started. You can see that. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to all the sponsors of the event today. Really appreciate the invitation to speak. And it's always an honor to speak on a program with Donele, who's been my sister in the movement for the last 30 years, and who so beautifully laid out the history and foundations of the movement there and its work in Detroit. I'm going to share a few of my own reflections about the movement and a few thoughts about the role of community researcher partnerships for environmental justice. And I also just want to start by affirming that beautiful land acknowledgement and stating and affirming that Black Lives Matter. And we don't need another Xavier Joe in our town, city, and we don't need another George Floyd. And that's what this movement is all about. So just going to move into the presentation. As Donele mentioned, in 1991, the summit was a really powerful, historic, and life-changing event for all of us who had the ability to attend it. For me, the most powerful moment was Dana Alston, who's seen speaking here, who spoke truth to power to the mainstream environmental organizations who were present. And I just want to share a few of her words. For us, the issues of environment do not stand alone by themselves. They are not narrowly defined. Our vision of the environment is woven into an overall framework of social, racial, and economic justice. It is deeply rooted in our cultures and our spirituality. It is based in a long tradition and understanding and respect for the natural world. The environment for us is where we live, where we work, and where we play. What we seek is a relationship based on equity, mutual respect, mutual interest, and justice. We refuse narrow definitions. It is not just ancient forest, it is not just saving the whales or saving other endangered species. These are all very important. We understand the cycle of life and the interconnectedness of life, but our communities and our people are endangered species too. After 30 years of the environmental justice movement, these words might seem familiar, but in that moment in 1991, these words were new and revolutionary and very powerful and compelling. They are words that galvanized and launched the movement. And I just felt it was important to start with that. So the environmental justice movement since 1991 has really given us so much. It has been a powerful force, not just for addressing the local threats that impacted communities face and our health and our life, but it's been a very powerful force shaping the broader environmental movement, the mainstream movement, public health and environmental policies, and environmental health sciences themselves. The environmental justice movement, importantly, is a movement based on principles and values. That is distinct from the mainstream environmental movement, which has not traditionally embraced values like civil rights, human rights, anti-racism, respect for self-determination, and cultural integrity. The environmental justice movement is a response to environmental racism, as Donele and Amy have both already indicated. The movement understands that environmental harm is not separate from, but it results from a legacy of racism and colonialism in our country, and is another manifestation of discrimination people of color experience in other aspects of life. The movement has helped to frame environmental issues more broadly than saving whales and trees, to encompass all the factors that affect us where we live, work, learn, as Donele added, pray and play. And then it's also been important in raising important concepts such as cumulative impact, just transition, social climate justice, which have become part of mainstream conversations because the environmental community has helped to lift them up. At the 1991 summit, we were given a charge to return to our communities and organize a movement, locally and regionally, to build for environmental justice, and we took that charge very seriously. This is a list of the Michiganders who were present at the summit, many of us from Detroit. And we, as I said, we came back to Detroit and began to organize and apply what we had learned and to build a movement for environmental justice. We realized shortly that Detroit, Michigan's largest city, 80% Black and disproportionately impacted by environmental harm of all kinds, did not have an office of the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. We organized and fought and got one opened. We held events to raise awareness about environmental justice and to build a movement. Detroit's first environmental justice gathering was in 1994, attended by 225 people. In this event, we came together to redefine environment for us as Detroiters, much as the way that the National Summit helped organize a redefinition for the whole movement. Donele, as a result of this, Detroiters Working for Environmental Justice was founded as an organization, and Donele was its founding director, and I was one of the founding board members. DWEJ lends critical support to communities across Detroit and the state who are fighting for their communities for environmental justice. And there's so many examples that I could share, but I want to just share two very briefly. The first is the struggle to close the Henry Ford Hospital incinerator, and that's me and Donele many years ago, and my daughter, who is now 24 years old, shutting down the Henry Ford incinerator. This involved a large coalition and diverse coalition that included Detroit residents, DWEJ, Ecology Center, Access, Sierra Club, and national partners like Greenpeace and Healthcare Without Harm. Together, we made a difference for the affected community and moved Henry Ford Health System to adopt more sustainable methods of handling their waste stream that was meeting their commitment to first do no harm. The other example I want to share is another incinerator. The Detroit incinerator has stood as a prime example of environmental racism in the city of Detroit for more than 3 decades. The majority of the trash it burned came from wealthier, whiter communities, 60% from Oakland County. While the burden of this pollution was borne by vulnerable communities, in the 1 mile radius surrounding the incinerator, the population was 87% people of color, 60% in poverty, and 20% unemployed. Detroiters paid the cost for this, $2.6 million per year in health costs. To add to that, the facility violated the Clean Air Act 750 times in a 5-year period. In 2019, after 33 years of operation, the Breathe Free Detroit campaign shut it down. So these are just a few examples. We've had losses and we've had victories, and the movement has really always understood that to really win, we need to change the institutions and policies that are creating the injustice, the disproportionate burden, and the lack of unequal protection for communities of color. The movement was felt immediately after the 1991 summit at the level of our government. Just a year after the 1991 summit, the US EPA established an Office of Environmental Justice, a community university partnerships grant program, and environmental justice small grants program, which provided seed money to support communities experiencing environmental justice. In 1994, a symposium on health research and needs to ensure environmental justice gathered community activists, government, labor, and business representatives to formulate recommendations for federal agencies, including US EPA and NIEHS, to ensure environmental justice. In 1994, President Clinton signed the Federal Executive Order 12898 on environmental justice, which was another landmark in our movement. Amazingly, the executive order remains intact today, surviving the Trump administration, and has the potential to come fruition under the Biden administration. These early events, and many like them, are having ripple effects even today in our government across programs, funding, and policies at the EPA, NIEHS, other government agencies, and research institutions. I just want to touch on the role of researchers in the environmental justice movement. Academic researchers can play a really critical role in supporting the environmental justice movement and gathering scientific evidence needed to document the environmental health disparities that exist, fighting pollution, working against unsafe working conditions, and bringing needed resources and expertise to the work. Researchers have been part of the movement from the very beginning. In 1990, a year before the summit, the People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, Professors Bunyan Bryant and Paul Mahai at the University of Michigan gathered key scholars and activists for a landmark symposium on race and the incidence of environmental hazards. But researchers and research institutions have also acted in ways that perpetuate harm and exacerbate the inequalities that communities experience. Differences in values between our movement, access to funding, and privilege between community and researcher can create mistrust and challenges to successful environmental justice research partnerships, especially if power dynamics are not openly explored. As mentioned, the movement is based on principles, and there are several sets of principles that can support maintaining trusting and healthy relationships among partners. The principles of environmental justice, as Donele mentioned, are foundational as a definition of environmental justice, but there are also principles of working together, which address partnership issues such as funding, transparency, and accountability. I especially like the Hermes principles, which are 6 simple principles, simple in theory, but always it's a practice, and that address working together across differences and can be applied in many different circumstances. And of course, the principles of community-based participatory research, and have to give a shout out to Barbara Israel and Amy Schultz and all of those at U of M for their essential work in helping to define, promote, and practice these principles in our movement. So working effectively with environmental justice partners requires equitable partnerships that equalize power between community and academic partners. To me, that includes understanding the principles and values of the environmental justice movement and your partners, understanding the principles of community-based participatory research, prioritizing the needs and concerns of the community, equitable decision-making in all aspects of the work, equitable distribution of funding and other resources, shared dissemination of the research findings in a way that makes sense for the community, and long-term commitment to the relationship. So I want to share a brief story about what equitable university community partnerships are not. This is a real story, but this is not exactly word for word. It's not calling a community-based organization the day before or the week before your grant is due, which literally happened to me, and saying, hi, I'm a researcher, a research assistant working in Dr. fill-in-the-blank's lab at fill-in-the-blank university, and we are submitting a proposal tomorrow to the US EPA, and we wonder if you'd be willing to sign on as our community partner. We've already written the grant. I'll tell you all about the research we're going to do, and no, there's not really a role for you, and no, we don't really have any money in the budget for you. We're just collecting and analyzing these environmental samples. No, we don't have the budget because if we gave you that, we wouldn't have the money to do the samples. But we do need a community partner. Will you sign on? So that's not word for word, but that's a shorthand version of an actual conversation that happened. And I know that Donele and every other environmental justice organization could share a story. And that's an extreme end of the continuum. But I share it because it is a continuum, and there's a lot of good and there's a lot of bad, and there's a lot that's sort of in between. And so I think we can all strive to do better, and that's why we're talking about it today. And of course, the good news is that there are great examples of much more equitable and genuine partnerships, and I just want to give a shout out to some of my favorites. I really had the honor to be a part of the Arab American Environmental Health Project, which was led by the Arab Community Center, Access, and Dr. Jerome Riago at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. We had 5 years of funding from IHSC to do this work. And importantly, and I think unusually, the Access, the community-based partner, was the grantee in this case. I don't think that happens very often, and I think we need to find ways for that to happen more. Of course, community action to promote healthy environments, CAFE, I'm really thrilled to be a part of that project at this point, and I know that many of you on the call are part of that as well. A real genuine partnership. And then also want to just give a shout out to Environmental Health Research to Action, the ERA project, which is really engaging community youth and led by Dr. Natalie Sampson at University of Michigan, Dearborn. So these are these kind of projects that are based on transparency, accountability, and true partnership are going to lead to better outcomes, both for researchers and for community members. And more importantly, are going to lead to improved environmental and public health conditions in our community. And so we need more researchers who truly understand and are committed to environmental justice and to community-based participatory research. That's going to help not only build our movement, it's going to help the conditions in our community. And with that, I look forward to questions and discussion, and I'm going to share some pictures of me and Donele and the movement through the years. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Huge applause. You guys covered a lot of ground, 30 years in about half an hour. And really appreciate your time and your energy and sharing your experiences, and Kathryn, including researchers, communities' experiences of working with researchers are not always positive ones. And I appreciate you sharing some of those as part of your conversation. So we have about 15 minutes left, some time for some conversation and questions, comments. Please feel free to either raise your hand or just pop a question into the chat or blurt it out if you have questions or comments that you would like to make. And I see a couple are already popping into the chat. Thanks for folks who are weighing in with some appreciation for our speakers.
Amy, Hanan has a question.
Thank you. Hanan.
Hi, I had a really quick question about recycling and how big of an impact it really has. Because I know for me, I'm huge about recycling. I get really upset when my family doesn't recycle or anything like that. But recently I read an article in, I believe, Reader's Digest, which I'm pretty sure is a reputable magazine. And they were talking about how that's basically like a very misleading misconception that we have, that recycling is changing the world, but it really isn't. So I don't know if that's something that you guys have some input on, but yeah, that's one question I had.
I can respond to that unless Donele wants.
Go ahead, Kathryn.
Okay. So I can say that, we hear about recycling a lot, and the original little slogan was reduce, reuse, recycle. Mm-hmm. And we don't talk a lot enough about reducing and reusing because there are limited finite resources in the earth, and everything that we make and take from the earth, we have to do something with, and we don't think enough about cycling it back into the economy. So one of the reasons I really, really hate incinerators is because they create pollution that is harming our communities, but also they're just taking valuable resources and burning them up. And I think that, recycling gets overemphasized because it's sort of the easy end of the spectrum, but we really need to focus on reducing. The reality is that many of the things that we consider to be recyclable are not, and they end up in other countries, and especially in Asia. There's a lot of plastic pollution in our oceans and around the world. And I think it's a very complex situation, but when we start to think of waste not as waste, but as materials that can recycle back into our economy, and that have limited amount of these resources in the earth, that we will think differently about how we use them. I think recycling is important, but it's not the most important thing.
So is it actually successful on the grand scale? Because I remember as a kid when we were taught reduce, reuse, recycle, the way it was presented, it was like, okay, you have a plastic bottle, you recycle it, and it's going to be used to make like a t-shirt or another box, and it's going to be automatically used to make something else. So is that actually being done?
So I think it's more complex, but I think, as I said, it's not a simple solution. And the real solution is to reduce the amount of resources that we use to create things that need to be dealt with. So that's it's a very complex conversation. So I don't want to take the whole time on one question, but and thank you. It's an important question. We could do a whole webinar on that.
next
topic.
Donele, did you want to weigh in on that too?
I just real quickly wanted to say, many communities, if you remember, someone made the statement that the incinerator in Detroit was burning like 60% of its the waste that came from came from Oakland County, for instance. And what many people don't realize is that there was a fight by many of us to ensure that recycling became an option for Detroiters. Detroiters did not enjoy that basic deal. And so while it is a complicated issue, there are many things related to this effort to continue managing waste in a harmful way that something as simple as recycling could have reduced even more of the waste going into that particular facility. And also, if there was a way for, Hannah, I appreciate your question, for folks outside of Detroit to be able to redirect their waste in a way that would not have caused the kind of harm that we know burning waste would and has.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Donele. Next in the queue, we have Teresa Landrum, and I just want to acknowledge Teresa as a longstanding environmental justice advocate based in 48217. So Teresa, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. And Donele and Amy, great presentation as always. I have a question. Mentioned by Amy, Donele, and Kathryn, you always mention community. And community are the ones most impacted by the environmental pollution that are located in these specific vicinities. It has not always been easy to involve community as co-partners in this. So what kind of mechanisms have you used over the years to engage, enlighten, and motivate community to become involved in the EJ fight? Thank you.
That's a great question, Teresa. I'd like to start off by attempting to answer that question because, one, with the principles, the 17 principles for environmental justice, we speak for ourselves. That is a very serious part of the principles for environmental justice. And to ensure that that occurs, there really has to be an intentional, deliberate outreach strategy that includes the community. I will also say, for many years, from the very beginning, because this was enlightening for me to realize that we were inundated with environmental problems as a community person. There were so many issues that we were confronted with that we began to sort of create environmental justice tours, and toxic tours, and those kind of things, primarily to show the community its community through the eyes of environmental justice. And why do I say that? Not that people who are living in these situations don't realize it, but sometimes it's become the norm. So much the norm that people are accustomed to living and experiencing that without realizing this is abnormal, it's inappropriate, it's dehumanizing, and helping people sort of unlock that to go grander and deeper into just getting people to become better advocates in their work. One, it starts there. And I just believe that providing information to help people understand what ways are established to ensure that there really becomes equal protection under the law, what agencies and whatever are there. How do you ensure that you teach someone how to access the policy arena, the enforcement arena in effective ways, engaging folks like academic researchers in a way that helps us to even inform more and to provide the kind of research that backs up what we know innately is needed, but oftentimes we need the data and other things to help policymakers listen to us. Those are some of the ways that I've found to be effective to make sure that people get the information they need, that they are supported in moving the needle around environmental protection, and that they are provided the resources and help to build capacity so that they can speak for themselves in a way that is authentic, in a way that is strong and respected. So I'll stop there. There's a lot of strategies, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, I want to just agree with everything that Donele said and add that, I think one of the things that I think is really important, and I think was more true early on in the environmental justice movement, was really the integration of arts and culture in the movement. And I think that that is really valuable. And it was very true at the summit and many of the early events. And I think that, we've integrated for example, in the campaign against the Detroit Incinerator, the Breathe Free Detroit campaign, we held pizza parties in parks around the incinerator in the summertime, in community gardens. So people came and had free pizza. We did silk screening of posters, telling people where to call to report air problems. We did silk screening of T-shirts. At just meetings, we integrated just fun activities that helped to kind of promote understanding as well as just having fun. We had community concerts with food and bands playing and so performances, and I think that those kind of things are really valuable because some of this stuff can be really heavy, and it's important to engage people in ways that makes it enjoyable, and they want to come back and be a part of continuing to make change.
I just want to say that one of the favorites that I've heard Kathryn and Donele talk about was part of the campaign to shut down the Henry Ford incinerator, where they got holiday cards and said, all I want for Christmas is to breathe free air, or clean air, and had people send those to the decision maker who had the power to shut down the incinerator. So lots of great creative ways to engage community members in the process. Okay, next in the queue, we have a question from Kathryn Hacker. Kathryn, you can unmute yourself.
Sure, thank you so much. First of all, this was a fantastic presentation. It's really great to sort of hear from you, and especially with your connections with your such strong connections with actual community activists. And I guess my question is, I'm coming from sort of an infectious disease perspective, and I feel like the environmental health justice movement has really taken a lead compared to other public health disciplines in sort of infectious disease epidemiology or chronic disease epidemiology. I guess I wanted to ask where you thought sort of that success has really come from in environmental health, and why you guys are really leading the charge forward.
I guess I'm not
Amy,
clear on that.
I think what I understand is this is a question directed at the public health community.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for me, Kathryn, let me put my little bias out there. For a long time, for me, I felt like the public health community was missing in action when you compare it to other political or policy sort of opportunities to change things. And for me, I'm really grateful to see and have the relationship that we have, like with the Cafe Project, with the Detroit Urban Research Center, and whatever, who really are known across this country for taking the charge and really making the partnerships and relationships with community very, very genuine. I would say that for me, as I know not very much about the whole health arena, but I can say that public health is essential to the quality of life, particularly when it comes to environmental exposures and whatever. And it seems to be a natural sort of step on the ladder to get things going. But I think and I would also say that the model that has been undertaken, particularly by like the Detroit Urban Research Center, is a great model that others could learn from. And I would also say that public health is often more in the face of people at the ground level and whatever than other sort of folks within that realm, right?
Right.
And so that means that it looks a little bit more natural. It makes a little bit more sense to kind of get there. But folks like you and others doing a variety of work across the spectrum, there's a place for you. We think about infectious diseases and all that in this pandemic. My God.
You're right, exactly.
Air quality, air pollution, and that kind of stuff, and the exacerbation of the coronavirus, there are links, right?
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I'll just put it out there, like, it may be that they're leading it because it makes sense to be sort of at that ground level, but there's opportunities to pick up the charge and take it to, to these other levels.
Thank you. That's really helpful to hear.
So we're drawing down to close to the end of our time. There's 2 questions in the chat. I'm going to read them both and let Donele and Kathryn take their pick about how they would like to engage them. The first is from Sharifa El-Sendor from the Henry Ford Health System in Detroit, who asks, how would you like to see hospitals and health systems support environmental justice? And then the second question is from Arthur Williams, who says, I recently viewed a video by W. Kamau Bell entitled Toxic America. It takes place in Chester, Pennsylvania, United States of America series. My question is, are there any collaborations of these issues, meaning environmental justice issues, nationwide? So, Kathryn and Donele.
I can take the hospital one if you want, healthcare one if you want to take the. So I'll just briefly address the healthcare issue. Yes, there's so much that the healthcare industry can do. I think just to become aware of these issues and to understand what's happening in your own community with respect to environmental justice. What are the environmental harms that the community is experiencing? And I think that there's so much. Healthcare is 18% of the U.S. economy, and healthcare institutions are not only have that sort of oath to do no harm, but they are in some ways contributors to the harm, as we saw with the incinerators and with other issues. They create a lot of waste. They create a lot of plastic. They are doing some things that could, be harmful, seen as harmful to the community. And I think organizations like Healthcare Without Harm have really taken the lead in helping the healthcare industry understand what their impact is, whether it's, waste disposal or healthy food systems, and how they can be contributing in better ways. And I just think that because this is fundamentally a public health issue, people's health and quality of life is being impacted, that hospitals and healthcare can do a lot more than I think they've seen it as their role to do. So I'm just going to leave it at that because we don't have a lot of time. Let Donele answer the other question.
I appreciate the question from Arthur. I will say that I'm not aware of any sort of national collaborative effort to work nationwide on sort of filming the efforts. I do know that there are many smaller projects and have been over the years where people have featured different environmental justice fights and efforts across the country. Chester, Pennsylvania is one of those that have been in the fight for a long time, very similar to Detroit. I will say recently I received a call from someone who's looking at doing some kind of effort, Shondaland, and I think lots of people might know this person who's done a lot of television programs and that kind of stuff. I think a number of sort of the bigger industry folks around sort of raising these issues around environmental justice, they're new to the party. There's always been sort of a feature on some of the bigger more traditional environmental issues, and sort of shout outs to leadership around environmental problems that save white people. But there hasn't been a lot of those kind of focus on people of color and struggling communities. And I'd like to see more of that. So hopefully, particularly as we're in this age of the Biden-Harris administration, where they may really bring this to a level of real change, there may be greater interest to collaborate on some of the more broader issues. Everybody's talking about environmental justice. And I would say, Kathryn, I guess our job there is done. We set out to do that, to make environmental justice.
Put it on the agenda, right?
And we did that. And so, hey, the future is very bright and big around making more change.
All right, I think that's going to do it for us in terms of time. And I want to give just a huge thanks to Kathryn and Donele for sharing their time with us, sharing this history with us, and also laying out a path forward, right? So so much work has been done over the last 30 years. So much work remains to be done. And I think you've really sort of set the tone for us as members of the public health community to think about what is the role that we can play in supporting the movement towards environmental justice. So thank you guys so much. Lots of thanks coming in the chat. I just want to encourage you guys. There's a lot of love there for both of you. So take a look at that. And thanks to Allison and Meredith for highlighting the final presentation in this series is coming up next Tuesday, same time, same place, and we'll be talking a bit about the Community Action to Promote Healthy Environments Partnership. So thanks everyone for joining, and hopefully we'll see some of you next week. Take good care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you for sharing your hour with us.